Hello, my friends, I'm Nora, and today I want to take you through this story slowly and carefully, because what happened in the case of retired Green Beret and physician assistant student Clint Bonnell, didn't just affect the people involved. It revealed how, inside a marriage that looked stable from the outside, love can quietly rot into control, obsession, and the kind of betrayal that feels impossible to accept until it's already too late. And I want you to imagine something with me before we begin. Not the loud parts, not the flashing lights, or the courtroom, or the headlines. I want you to imagine the ordinary quiet, a driveway at night, a house that looks like every other house on the street. A routine that has been repeated so many times, it doesn't even feel like a routine anymore. Just life. Because cases like this don't announce themselves the way you wish they would. They don't arrive with warning music. They arrive in normal moments, and then suddenly, normal is gone. Clint Bonnell was 50 years old. If you passed him in a grocery store or at a gas station, you might have noticed the way he carried himself. That alert, steady posture you often see in people who have spent years learning how to stay calm when things go wrong. He was a retired Army Green Beret and had worked as a medic, the kind of role that turns you into a witness to other people's worst days, the kind of role that teaches you the value of time, the cost of hesitation, and the weight of responsibility. People close to him described him as reliable and committed, someone whose absence would be noticed immediately because he didn't just vanish from obligations. He showed up, he followed through, he did what he said he would do. And that detail matters because this story begins with a disappearance that didn't make sense to the people who knew him best. In January of 2025, Clint was living in the Fayetteville area in North Carolina, and he was in a new chapter of life. After retiring from the military, he was enrolled at Methodist University in the physician assistant program. It was not a casual choice, not a hobby. He was serious about it, the kind of student who didn't coast, who didn't skip, who didn't shrug off deadlines. Those around him described him as deeply engaged in his cohort, connected to his classmates, someone who had already become a presence in that small academic world. Now, I want you to hold that picture. A man who spent years operating in high-stakes environments, who returned to civilian life and immediately threw himself into another demanding path. For some people, retirement is a slowing down. For Clint, it seems to have been a refocusing, taking everything he learned about emergency care and discipline and applying it to building a future. But there was another part of his life that had quietly become complicated. And if you've ever watched someone try to do the right thing in a relationship that's already broken, you'll recognize the tension that starts to build in the background. Clint was married to Shana Cloud. And according to reporting later tied to the investigation, the marriage was not what it looked like from the outside. By the time Clint entered this new phase of his life, there were signs that the relationship had been fractured for a while. The kind of fracture that doesn't always involve screaming fights or dramatic breakups. Sometimes it's colder than that. Sometimes it's simply two people living alongside each other, carrying old resentments and pretending they can keep it contained. And then there was a third presence, the kind that can turn a slow fracture into a sudden break. Clint was seeing someone else, Kelly Edwards. In interviews after the case became public, Edwards described their connection and the way Clint spoke about his marriage, not as a man impulsively escaping, but as someone who believed the marriage had ended emotionally and who was already taking steps toward divorce. She described him as someone who tried to see the best in others, a trait that sounds beautiful until you realize how often it can become a vulnerability. Because sometimes the people who believe in peaceful endings are the least prepared for someone who has no intention of allowing one. The last stretch of Clint's life, as investigators would later describe it, was marked by a decision. The decision to finally make the divorce real, to stop living in limbo, to stop managing appearances, to step toward a future that felt honest. And it's in that decision, not the dramatic kind, not the reckless kind, but the careful, legal kind, that this case turns dark. Clint was last seen on January 27, 2025, in the Grays Creek area near Fayetteville, and the timeline of that day has been reported in fragments: a workout, school, normal movement, normal life. The kind of day that ends with you thinking about tomorrow's responsibilities. If you were Clint, you likely believed tomorrow was going to come, and you were going to keep building. But by the next morning, he didn't show up. On January 28th, Clint failed to attend class, and for his cohort and his school, this wasn't just a student missing a lecture. It was out of character. It was alarming enough that an employee at the university requested a welfare check. Think about that for a moment. The fact that other adults in his academic life noticed quickly and took action quickly. That tells you how consistent he must have been, how present, how dependable. People don't call for welfare checks over someone who is casually absent all the time. Deputies went to the home and encountered Shana Cloud. She reportedly told them she had not seen Clint since the day before, but there were details that didn't match the idea of a man who simply left. His vehicle was there, his belongings were there, things you don't leave behind if you're choosing to disappear, items that suggested he had come home and then stopped existing in the way a living person exists. And I want you to imagine what that does to the people who care about someone like Clint. The way your mind tries to form explanations, because the alternative feels too heavy. You consider accidents, medical emergencies. Maybe he had an urgent call and left quickly. Maybe he got disoriented. Maybe. Because if you let your mind go to the worst place too soon, it feels like you're betraying hope. But hope, in cases like this, gets tested fast. As the day continued, Kelly Edwards tried to reach him and couldn't. In later reporting, she described being in frequent contact with him and sensing immediately that something was wrong when messages went unanswered. She called 911 and pushed the concern further. Now, this is one of those moments that often becomes a defining contrast in true crime stories. One person who acts like time matters and another who seems strangely passive. Investigators would later build their case around physical evidence and digital trails, but early on, the human behavior is what raises the first quiet red flags. This disappearance did not linger for weeks as a mystery of maybe he ran away. It accelerated. The concern escalated. Investigators started digging, and when law enforcement starts digging, they start comparing stories to data. Because data doesn't get defensive, it doesn't get emotional, it doesn't try to protect itself, it simply exists. And what they found, according to reporting, was that Clint's phone records indicated he came to the residence that night and did not leave. This is where you should pause with me, because this is one of the most haunting truths in modern investigations. We live in an era where our movements leave shadows behind us. Not just on cameras, but through location pings, connection logs, timestamps. And for someone guilty, that can become a trap. Because you can lie with your mouth, but your phone tells a different story. Over the following weeks, investigators executed search warrants and conducted multiple searches connected to Shana Cloud, including her vehicle and other areas tied to her movements. Authorities described building a timeline through digital evidence, reviewing video footage, analyzing records, assembling something that could stand up to scrutiny. And while the full details were not publicly laid out in every report, the direction of the case became clearer as the investigation moved from missing person to homicide. That shift is never casual. Law enforcement doesn't reassign cases like that because of a hunch alone. It happens when the evidence starts to point not to an accident, not to a voluntary disappearance, but to foul play. And then, on February 25th, 2025, something was found that pulled this case out of uncertainty and into horror. A 911 call came in from a rural area off Gainey Road, roughly 3 miles from the home. A pond, a quiet body of water, the kind of place you might never look at twice, the kind of place that could feel peaceful on the surface. But that day, it wasn't peaceful. Human remains were reported in the water. When remains are found in that condition, identification is not instant. There are procedures, forensic steps, time-consuming comparisons. And for families, this becomes a special kind of torture. The state of being almost sure, but not officially sure. Grief hovering over you, but paperwork still catching up. DNA was used to confirm identity, and investigators worked with the Armed Forces Medical Examiner system as part of that process. A reminder that Clint wasn't just a name in a local case. He was someone whose military service was part of his record, part of his identity, even in death. On March 28, 2025, authorities confirmed that the remains belonged to Clint Bonnell. And on that same day, Shana Cloud was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and concealment of death. When you hear those charges, I want you to notice the language carefully. Not just murder, concealment of death. That charge exists because the system believes what happened did not end with violence. It continued with effort, with choices made after the fact, with actions that weren't panic in a single moment, but a sequence of decisions. And this is where people often ask the question that feels almost unavoidable. Why? Why would a spouse do this? Why would a marriage end this way instead of on paper in a courtroom, the way most broken marriages end? And I have to tell you, you can't answer why with a single word. Not jealousy, not money, not anger, not even betrayal. Those are ingredients, but not the whole dish. Because for something like this to happen, something deeper usually exists. A need to control the outcome at any cost. In public reporting, investigators and prosecutors suggested that a pending divorce could have been a motive, that Clint's decision to end the marriage may have been the turning point that triggered something final. In one of the most chilling details, the reporting describes how Clint's last known communications included a message indicating he was taking steps toward ending the marriage. That message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an insult. It was a line in the sand. And sometimes, to a person who cannot tolerate losing control, a line in the sand feels like an attack. The first court appearances after an arrest like this are always revealing in a strange way, not because they prove guilt or innocence, that's for trial, evidence, due process, but because they show you the emotional architecture of everyone involved, the defendant, the family, the people sitting behind them, the faces that are now forced into the same room. Reporting described Clint's sister, Stephanie Firkins, present in court, and also described a young woman tied to the family, Razzie Cloud, Shana Cloud's daughter, sitting in the same space, caught between identities, the daughter of the accused, and someone who had also lived in the orbit of the man who was now gone. This is one of the quiet tragedies people don't talk about enough in family homicide cases. The crime doesn't just remove one person, it fractures everyone connected to them. It forces people into impossible emotional math. Who do you grieve? Who do you defend? Who do you believe? How do you hold love and horror in the same hands? During a court appearance, a judge denied bond, and the case was treated with the severity you would expect when the allegations involve murder and concealment. Prosecutors argued evidence pointed to Shana Cloud. The details mentioned in reporting include the use of investigative findings and timelines. And even without every piece of evidence laid out publicly, the overall picture prosecutors painted was not of an accident, not of a misunderstanding, but of a deliberate act and the concealment that followed. And at this point, I want to slow down and talk directly to you, because this is where a lot of viewers feel a confusing emotional shift. At first, you follow the story as an investigation, a missing person, a welfare check, a search. But once the body is found and the spouse is charged, the story becomes something else. It becomes a confrontation with a reality many people don't want to believe, that a home can become the most dangerous place, not because of strangers, but because of the person who knows you best. Clint survived deployments. He lived in environments where threats were expected, where vigilance was trained into muscle memory. And yet, according to the case as reported, he did not survive the threat that was waiting in his own domestic life. There's a particular cruelty in that, because it means that all the strategies that might protect you in war, distance, intel, protective gear, a team, don't translate cleanly to a living room. In a home, you let your guard down because love requires you to. Even if the love is dying, the habit of trust remains. The idea that this person might hurt you is something most people can't truly process until it happens. And maybe that's the most unsettling psychological element in this case. Not just that violence occurred, but that it occurred at the point when Clint believed he was transitioning into honesty, into paperwork, into a legal end. He wasn't disappearing into secrecy. He was trying to formalize the truth. If you've ever seen a relationship end badly, you already know that the most dangerous moment isn't always the breakup itself. It's the moment when one person realizes the other person is truly leaving, not just threatening to leave, not just cooling off, leaving in a real way, with lawyers and plans and a future that doesn't include them. And what do you do if you're someone who cannot tolerate abandonment? If you interpret leaving not as a boundary, but as humiliation? If you see divorce not as the end of a marriage, but as an erasure of your power? Some people lash out verbally, some people destroy property, some people smear reputations, and in the worst cases, the cases that turn into documentaries like this, some people decide that if they can't control the relationship, they will control the ending. The public nature of this case also brought attention to the web of assets and legal complications that can arise after a death under suspicious circumstances. There was reporting of a legal dispute related to assets that was later dismissed, highlighting how quickly practical concerns collide with grief. Houses, vehicles, accounts, all suddenly caught in the machinery of courts, while the emotional reality hasn't even settled. And in the background of all of it, there was the community, classmates, neighbours, the school that had noticed his absence, the people who had to keep going to class while knowing that one of their own had not simply dropped out, but had been lost in the most brutal way. This is one of those cases where, even after an arrest, there is no clean closure, because closure would require you to rewind time, to undo a conversation, to take back a decision, to tell Clint not to go home that night, to tell him to meet a friend instead, to tell him to stay somewhere else, to tell him to treat that moment like a tactical scenario instead of a personal one. But that's not how real life works, and that's what makes these stories hurt. The question of what exactly happened inside that house, the exact sequence, the precise moment, the final realization, is something the legal process will attempt to prove through evidence. But emotionally, what lingers is simpler and heavier. The image of a man who was trying to move forward, cut down at the point he believed he was finally stepping into freedom. And then there is Kelly Edwards, who spoke publicly about the devastation, describing how impossible it felt to comprehend. In cases like this, partners outside the marriage are often painted in simplistic colours by the public. Villain, seductress, homewrecker, interloper, but real life is not that neat. She wasn't the one who made vows. She wasn't the one who lived inside that house. She was someone who believed she was dating a man who was already in the process of ending his marriage. And whatever you think about that, you can still recognize the human trauma of suddenly realizing the person you care about has vanished, and then learning that he didn't vanish at all, that he was taken. And there is Stephanie Firkins, a sister who has to hold the fact that her brother survived so much only to be lost in a way that feels senseless. Families often describe waking up and reliving it, the looping shock, the disbelief that resets every morning, because grief after violence is not just sadness, it's a constant confrontation with the manner of death, the injustice, the unanswered questions, the rage that has nowhere clean to go. And then there is Shana Cloud, caught in an emotional trap no child should ever be placed in. When your parent is accused of killing someone you may have known as a family figure, your identity splits. You can love your mother and still be horrified by what she's accused of. You can miss the man who was lost and still feel loyalty to the person who raised you. And people on the outside often demand simple answers. Do you believe it? Do you support her? How can you? But those demands ignore the fact that love is not a switch. It's a history, and history doesn't disappear just because the present has turned dark. As of the reporting available, Shana Cloud remained in custody as the case continued through the court system, and investigators indicated that searches were ongoing in connection with the remains and evidence. Time moves differently in legal cases. For the public, it becomes an update every few months. For the families, it becomes a slow, grinding stretch of days where every hearing and procedural step reopens the wound. So what are we left with when we step back? We're left with a story that begins in the most ordinary place, a home, a story that reminds you that danger is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes it's a familiar voice in the kitchen. Sometimes it's someone who knows your schedule, your habits, your vulnerabilities, someone who can watch you plan for the future and decide that if they can't be part of it, you won't reach it at all. And if you feel unsettled hearing this, that's a normal reaction. You're not meant to swallow this easily, because the unsettling part isn't just the crime, it's the idea that the path to it can look like normal life until the very last moment. If you take anything from this story, I want it to be this. When someone shows you that they don't respect your boundaries, when they treat your autonomy like an insult, when they react to your independence with threats, control, surveillance, or escalating anger, those are not relationship problems. Those are warning signs, and you deserve to take them seriously, even if doing so feels dramatic, especially if doing so feels dramatic. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to the wrong person is simply try to leave.